Jesus is not a liberal. Many there are who think Jesus was a liberal. Arguments have been made painting him as a communist. People see his compassion and charity as examples of a liberal mindset. His injunction to give up the ownership of property, which Christians ignore, is viewed as an early promotion of communism. Jesus, however, is not, was not and cannot be, a liberal. Liberals cannot believe in God in any meaningful sense, and the compassion of Jesus goes only so far and certainly stops at the unforgivable sin. However, no one is likely to claim Christ was a capitalist. But Jesus not being for capitalism, does not make him a liberal. Indeed, if we assume Jesus is God, is it not more reasonable to suppose his economic teachings are not going to reflect what secular writers advocate? But if Jesus was neither a capitalist nor a liberal or socialist, what was he? If he was neither on the political right or left, are Christians one or the other? It may be that many Christians are happy to know Jesus was not a capitalist. Many in the church are relieved to know his views cannot be equated with libertarianism. Maybe his unequivocal opposition to greed pleases you, because this means he must be a communist. Even so, many of those who argue Jesus was a socialist continue being capitalists. No one wants to be without private property. But have we considered the possibility that God knows more about economics than either Karl Marx or Adam Smith, and more than even the Chicago School? What if the choice is not between communism and capitalism, but between God's way and Babylon? What if there is an absolute right and a categorical wrong, and these categories are diametrically opposed and inversely related? The most general definition of a liberal is one who loves freedom. To be liberal is to be free. A liberal is free of all restraint, a part of those he puts on himself. The liberal becomes his standard and moral authority. Liberals tend to be tolerant of different views and standards of behavior, so long as his own freedom is not impacted. Your freedom ends where my body begins, is how liberals phrase it. Liberal tolerance is not a trait one sees in Jesus. The existence of hell is not a sign of tolerance. The only intolerance liberals are guilty of is limits on their freedom. This is why they hate Jesus. Jesus tells liberals they are not free to do as they please. The problem, Jesus tells us, is in the mirror. Liberals are open to trying new things. Liberals are willing to discard traditional values, social mores and established practices. They just do not wish to be told what to do. Liberals have a schizoid relationship to freedom. Liberals love freedom for themselves, but they fear it in others. They want to increase democracy, distribute wealth more evenly, and protect the personal freedom of the individual. However, they do not want any of this to negatively impact their life. Liberals rely on social institutions to set the moral tone, because liberals do not have a fixed moral compass. Thus, liberal morality is normalized by familiarization. Being subjected to a mode of behavior that might be offensive in its initial exposure becomes the norm after constant exposure. Any behavior, no matter how repugnant initially, will eventually be considered acceptable if made legal. If morality does not have a fixed compass. But behind this love of freedom is a servile reliance on the state. Liberals require governments to ensure there are no negative consequences for allowing others to have freedom. They also want to be protected from the consequences of their own freedom. For example, STDs are not supposed to be the result of having multiple sex partners. There is no benefit to being liberal if a liberal suffers any setbacks or undue hardships from careless behavior. If a liberal does not want to do the work or pay the costs, liberals expect the state to fund the program. Liberals do not believe there ought to have to choose between having their cake and eating it. Consequences imply a need to consider costs and benefits. Liberals tend to be guided by emotion and just wish to enjoy life. Liberals believe freedom must be enjoyed, without having to worry if the cost was worth it. They do not wish the responsibility of determining the best course of action, given a set of options. Liberal freedom means a liberal gets to make a choice, without giving up anything. One could say liberals want what they want without having to worry about future costs. Future costs are viewed as a limit on freedom. Liberal morality comes from their personal values, their likes and dislikes. They claim no one needs God, but that is because they think morality means we do what we want to do. They expect the government to pander to their emotional preferences. If they are passive and fear violence, their morality demands a strong government. If they are aggressive and strong, they will want a smaller, less interventionist state. The morality of an aggressive liberal will be poles apart from the moral code of a pacifist atheist. Liberals do not care about traditions or anything that takes away their personal freedom. To subscribe to a moral code that is deduced from a first-order principle is anathema. To even admit there is a first-order principle from which all truth is derived, is to call into question their freedom to do as they feel right. If anything typifies a liberal, it is their focus on induction as the only way to reason. Liberals believe that if he or she sees something that is wrong, the state ought to correct it. Liberals are not morally culpable. If something makes a liberal emotionally uncomfortable, then the state must stop the triggering incident from happening. There is no conception that an uncomfortable situation might need to be endured. The liberal feels entitled to always feel emotionally protected, as if they live in a prolonged infancy. If a liberal is emotionally pained, the liberal has been wronged. We are wrong for causing the liberal to feel they have been wronged. For a liberal, their emotional state determines reality. Jesus never considered himself entitled. Jesus never claimed his feelings had to be respected. He made himself of no account. He never went to the Romans and complained the scribes and Pharisees' comments were triggering. He did not whine that he was bullied by unbelievers. Jesus made himself lower, not higher. Philippians 2:7 But made himself of no reputation, and took upon him the form of a servant, and was made in the likeness of men. Hebrews 2:9 But we see Jesus, who was made a little lower than the angels for the suffering of death, crowned with glory and honor, that he by the grace of God should taste death for every man. Jesus never told scribe or Pharisee his feelings were hurt. Jesus is not a liberal. When asked by the rich man what he needed to do to be saved, Jesus told him to sell what he had, give the proceeds to the poor and follow him. The rich man demurred. This is often taken to mean Jesus was communist. But Jesus recognized the man's right to his property and his right to dispose of it as he wished or not dispose of it at all. When Ananias and Sapphira sold a parcel of land and kept back some of the proceeds, they were killed, not for being selfish but for lying to the Lord. No one told them they had to sell their land. The disciples did not say they had to pay capital gains nor give 1/10 of all they had to the church. Selling the land for the brethren was their choice, however. Once they had made this choice and said the value belonged to God, holding back some of this was stealing from God. Acts 5:1-10. But a certain man named Ananias, with Sapphira his wife, sold a possession, and kept back part of the price, his wife also being privy to it, and brought a certain part, and laid it at the apostles' feet. But Peter said, Ananias, why hath Satan filled thine heart to lie to the Holy Ghost, and to keep back part of the price of the land? Whiles it remained, was it not thine own? And after it was sold, was it not in thine own power? Why hast thou conceived this thing in thine heart? Thou hast not lied unto men, but unto God. And Ananias hearing these words fell down, and gave up the ghost, and great fear came on all them that heard these things. And the young men arose, wound him up, and carried him out, and buried him. And it was about the space of 3 hours after, when his wife, not knowing what was done, came in. And Peter answered unto her, Tell me whether ye sold the land for so much? And she said, Yea, for so much. Then Peter said unto her, How is it that ye have agreed together to tempt the Spirit of the Lord? Behold, the feet of them which have buried thy husband are at the door, and shall carry thee out. Then fell she down straightway at his feet, and yielded up the ghost, and the young men came in, and found her dead, and, carrying her forth, buried her by her husband. Charity is not unknown to liberals, but they rely on government programs. Jesus expected people to give from the heart. He would not agree that students had to serve as volunteers for a certain number of hours to graduate. Being forced to be charitable is not what charity is about. Liberals do believe in private ownership, or most do, but ultimately ownership is not a right most liberals put much weight on. Nothing really belongs to anyone, in the liberal way of thinking. Ownership is contingent upon social needs. There is no conception of an inalienable right to own what one created, which is why they have issue with God being the creator. Perhaps liberals are resentful of God's claim to the earth. Possession of property for a liberal is relative to the needs of the state. If the need is manifest, then one's property may be confiscated and assigned to another, in the pursuit of a higher good. Liberalism has a strong social engineering component, therefore what would have been thought repugnant is normalized for a greater good. Gender confusion results from the liberal notion that no truth is absolute, and so there is no truth that can be imposed on others, without infringing their rights. Reality is something we choose along with our gender. All resources are viewed as available for the greater good. Resources are to be distributed to achieve an ideological end. Government is a process in which personal goals become manifested as government policy. The more a liberal is able to transform individuals into a tool for achieving a social agenda, the more the state and its programs move away from promoting personal freedom to communism. But the more the state becomes the agent through which freedom is sought, the more freedom is lost. But liberalism cannot exist without the state. The personal agenda and the social agenda of a liberal require an interventionist state. Despite what is often argued, Jesus never supported the state. At the very beginning, when Israel demanded a king as the pagans had, the state was declared to be a means for usurping the authority of God. The state is not a threat to good works, but it is not an agency that engages in them either. 1 Samuel 8:5-7 And said unto him, Behold, thou art old, and thy sons walk not in thy ways, now make us a king to judge us like all the nations. But the thing displeased Samuel, when they said, Give us a king to judge us. And Samuel prayed unto the Lord. And the Lord said unto Samuel, Hearken unto the voice of the people in all that they say unto thee, for they have not rejected thee, but they have rejected me, that I should not reign over them. The state was given the sword, but the power of the state was not to be feared by those who did good works. Romans 13:1-8. Let every soul be subject unto the higher powers. For there is no power but of God, the powers that be are ordained of God. Whosoever therefore resisteth the power, resisteth the ordinance of God, and they that resist shall receive to themselves damnation. For rulers are not a terror to good works, but to the evil. Wilt thou then not be afraid of the power? Do that which is good, and thou shalt have praise of the same, for he is the minister of God to thee for good. But if thou do that which is evil, be afraid, for he beareth not the sword in vain, for he is the minister of God, a revenger to execute wrath upon him that doeth evil. Wherefore ye must needs be subject, not only for wrath, but also for conscience sake. For this cause pay ye tribute also, for they are God's ministers, attending continually upon this very thing. Render therefore to all their dues, tribute to whom tribute is due, custom to whom custom, fear to whom fear, honor to whom honor. Owe no man anything, but to love one another, for he that loveth another hath fulfilled the law. Yet how can one reconcile the words of God that the state is a rejection of God's suzerainty with Jesus' statement, Whosoever resisteth the power, resisteth the ordinance of God? Those who say the state is part of God's plan face a paradox. Did God change his mind about the state being a rejection of himself? Was God wrong either about the state being a rejection of him or about man needing to obey the state? Or, is there a possibility mankind has interpreted one or other of these passages wrongly? Do you think you might be in error and not God? The first statement seems plain enough to assume no error in interpretation can be made, and so if this cannot be misconstrued, it is fair to assume that God is not a supporter of governments, no matter what the other statement says or seems to say. The central meaning of the above passage is that Christians are not to precipitate evil. This is not a new teaching. A government, Jesus says, is not a terror to good works. But this only means the state cannot usurp or overcome good works. Let's assume the state is not godly, but instead of opposing them, why not focus on doing good works? So, let's see how this plays this out. A king comes to power and rules, the people obey him. But the probability is that the more his subjects comply, the more power a ruler is likely to exercise. When we do not oppose the ruler, we heap coals of condemnation upon his head. But and this is the other side of the argument, if we all obey the ruler, what need is there for the ruler? Rulers are not a terror to good works, but who defines the good works? At some point the rule of man and the rule of God will be shown to be incompatible. However, it is not Christians who ought to precipitate rebellion. This is not the place for a solution. However, there is one. If we all just paid our costs and no one attempted to externalize costs onto society and future generations, the state would be made redundant. If we followed Christ, the state would not exist, because there would be no need for it to exist. Mankind created the need for the state when he disobeyed God. Jesus never taxed anyone nor demanded they give their wealth to others. Liberal ideology is based on social engineering, the redistribution of resources to reflect a particular vision of the New World Order. Liberals may preach the joy of giving, but they do not rely on people's generosity. Liberals back up their agenda with the power of the state. The economics capitalism is predicated on greed and the legitimizing function of the state, which assigns and defends private capital. Only a liberal believes the possession of private property is predicated on an alliance of elites and the state. The state never attempted to lessen its power to ensure God was given his due. The state has sought to increase its power but, in the process, lost legitimacy before God. There is only one ultimate power, and that is the power over life and death. Jesus scorned those who thought the accumulation of wealth reduced risk. No matter how risk is reduced, one will still die. We are told not to worry about tomorrow. God has power over life and death. The state may have power over life but not death. The liberal system provides insurance, but God wants us to rely on him. If we loved God, we would not be exposed to risk. If our house burned down, our Christian neighbors would replace it. If a family fell on hard times, friends and neighbors would assist them. There would be no need for insurance, if we followed Jesus. If capitalism is about personal gain and personal accomplishment and a reliance on the individual's ability to amass personal possessions, and Jesus mocks this as being ineffective, then Jesus is not a liberal. If Jesus told us to love one another and love our neighbor and not to rely on the state for succor, then Jesus is not a liberal. If Jesus never touted the state as the solution to mankind's problems, then Jesus is not a liberal.